Chapter 7 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Chant. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 7. The Inquest on John Phillips. Several of the notabilities of the neighbourhood had ridden or driven to the inn, attracted, of course, by curiosity, and the man with the maimed hand immediately joined them as they stood talking apart from the rest of us. Now, I knew all such people of our parts well enough by sight, but I did not know this man, who certainly belonged to their class, and I turned to Mr. Lindsey, asking him who was this gentleman that had just ridden up. He glanced at me with evident surprise at my question. "What?" said he. "You don't know him? That's the man there's been so much talk about lately. Sir Gilbert Carstairs of Hathercleugh House, the new successor to the old baronetcy." I knew at once what he meant. Between Norham and Berwick, overlooking the Tweed, and on the English side of the river, stood an ancient, picturesque, romantic old place, half mansion, half castle, set in its own grounds and shut off from the rest of the world by high walls and groves of pine and fir, which had belonged for many a generation to the old family of Carstairs. Its last proprietor, Sir Alexander Carstairs, 6th Baronet, had been a good deal of a recluse, and I never remember seeing him but once, when I caught sight of him driving in the town. A very, very old man, who looked like what he really was, a hermit. He had been a widower for many long years, and though he had 3 children, it was little company that he seemed to have ever got out of them, for his eldest son, Mr. Michael Carstairs, had long since gone away to foreign parts, and had died there. His younger son, Mr. Gilbert, was, it was understood, a doctor in London, and never came near the old place, and his one daughter, Mrs. Ralston, though she lived within 10 miles of her father, was not on good terms with him. It was said that the old gentleman was queer and eccentric, and hard to please or manage. However that may be, it is certain that he lived a lonely life till he was well over 80 years of age. And he had died suddenly, not so very long before James Gilverthwaite came to lodge with us, and Mr. Michael being dead, unmarried, and therefore without family, the title and estate had passed to Mr. Gilbert, who had recently come down to Hathercleugh House and taken possession, bringing with him, though he himself was getting on in years, being certainly over 50, a beautiful young wife whom, they said, he had recently married, and was, according to various accounts which had crept out, a very wealthy woman in her own right. So here was Sir Gilbert Carstairs, 7th Baronet, before me, chatting away to some of the other gentlemen of the neighbourhood, and there was not a doubt in my mind that he was the man whom I had seen on the road the night of the murder. I was close enough to him now to look more particularly at his hand, and I saw that the 2 first fingers had completely disappeared, and that the rest of it was no more than a claw. It was not likely that there could be 2 men in our neighbourhood thus disfigured. Moreover, the general build of the man, the tweed suit of grey that he was wearing, the attitude in which he stood, all convinced me that this was the person I had seen at the crossroads, holding his electric torch to the face of his map. And I made up my mind there and then to say nothing in my evidence about that meeting, for I had no reason to connect such a great gentleman as Sir Gilbert Carstairs with the murder, and it seemed to me that his presence at those crossroads was easily enough explained. He was a big, athletic man, and was likely fond of a walk, and he had been taking one that evening, and, not as yet being over familiar with the neighbourhood, having lived so long away from it, had got somewhat out of his way in returning home. No, I would say nothing. I had been brought up to have a firm belief in the old proverb which tells you that the least said is the soonest mended. We were all packed pretty tightly in the big room of the inn when the coroner opened his inquiry, and at the very onset of the proceedings he made a remark which was expected by all of us that knew how these things are done and are likely to go. We could not do much that day. There would have to be an adjournment, after taking what he might call the surface evidence. He understood, he remarked, with a significant glance at the police officials and at one or two solicitors that were there, that there was some extraordinary mystery at the back of this matter, and that a good many things would have to be brought to light before the jury could get even an idea as to who it was that had killed the man whose body had been found, and as to the reason for his murder. And all they could do that day, he went on, was to hear such evidence, not much, as had already been collected, and then to adjourn. Mr. Lindsey had said to me as we drove along to the inn that I should find myself the principal witness, and that Gilverthwaite would come into the matter more prominently than anybody fancied. And this, of course, was soon made evident. What there was to tell of the dead man up to that time was little. There was the medical evidence that he had been stabbed to death by a blow from a very formidable knife or dagger which had been driven into his heart from behind. There was the evidence which Chisholm and I had collected at Peebles and at Cornhill Station, and at the inn across the Coldstream Bridge. There was the telegram which had been sent by Mr. Gavin Smeaton, whoever he might be, from Dundee. And that was about all. And it came to this, that here was a man who, in registering at a Peebles hotel, called himself John Phillips, and wrote down that he came from Glasgow, where, up to that moment, the police had failed to trace anything relating to such a person. And this man had travelled to Cornhill Station from Peebles, been seen in an adjacent inn, had then disappeared, and had been found about 2 hours later, murdered in a lonely place. "And the question comes to this," observed the coroner. "What was this man doing at that place, and who was he likely to meet there? We have some evidence on that point, and," he added, with one shrewd glance at the legal folk in front of him and another at the jurymen at his side, "I think you'll find, gentlemen of the jury, that it's just enough to whet your appetite for more." They had kept my evidence to the last, and if there had been a good deal of suppressed excitement in the crowded room when Chisholm and the doctor and the landlord of the inn on the other side of Coldstream Bridge gave their testimonies, there was much more when I got up to tell my tale and to answer any questions that anybody liked to put to me. Mine, of course, was a straight enough story, told in a few sentences, and I did not see what great amount of questioning could arise out of it. But whether it was that he fancied I was keeping something back, or that he wanted, even at that initial stage of the proceedings, to make matters as plain as possible, a solicitor that was representing the county police began to ask me questions. "There was no one else with you in the room when this man Gilverthwaite gave you his orders?" he asked. "No one," I answered. "And you've told me everything that he said to you?" "As near as I can recollect it, every word." "He didn't describe the man you were to meet?" "He didn't, in any way." "Nor tell you his name?" "Nor tell me his name." "So that you'd no idea whatever as to who it was that you were to meet, nor for what purpose he was coming to meet Gilverthwaite, if Gilverthwaite had been able to meet him?" "I'd no idea," said I. "I knew nothing but that I was to meet a man and give him a message." He seemed to consider matters a little, keeping silence, and then he went off on another tack. "What do you know of the movements of this man Gilverthwaite while he was lodging with your mother?" he asked. Next to nothing, I replied. But how much? He inquired. You know something? Of my own knowledge, next to nothing, I repeated. I've seen him in the streets and on the pier, and taking his walks on the walls and over the Border Bridge, and I've heard him say that he'd been out in the country. And that's all. Was he always alone? He asked. I never saw him with anybody, never heard of his talking to anybody, nor of his going to see a soul in the place, I answered. And first and last, he never brought anyone into our house, nor had anybody asked at the door for him. And with the exception of that registered letter we've heard of, he never had a letter delivered to him all the time he lodged with you? He said. Not one, said I. From first to last, not one. He was silent again for a time, and all the folk staring at him and me. And for the life of me I could not think what other questions he could get out of his brain to throw at me. But he found one, and put it with a sharp cast of his eye. Now, did this man ever give you, while he was in your house, any reason at all for his coming to Berwick? He asked. Yes, I answered. He did that when he came asking for lodgings. He said he had folk of his own buried in the neighbourhood, and he was minded to take a look at their graves, and at the old places where they'd lived. Giving you, in fact, an impression that he was either a native of these parts, or had lived here at some time, or had kindred that had? He asked. Just that, I replied. Did he tell you the names of such folk, or where they were buried, or anything of that sort? He suggested. No, never, said I. He never mentioned the matter again. And you don't know that he ever went to any particular place to look at any particular grave or house? He inquired. No, I replied, but we knew that he took his walks into the country on both sides Tweed. He hesitated a bit, looked at me and back at his papers, and then, with a glance at the coroner, sat down. And the coroner, nodding at him as if there was some understanding between them, turned to the jury. It may seem without the scope of this inquiry, gentlemen, he said, but the presence of this man Gilverthwaite in the neighbourhood has evidently so much to do with the death of the other man, whom we know as John Phillips, that we must not neglect any pertinent evidence. There is a gentleman present that can tell us something. Call the Reverend Septimus Ridley. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England.
Chapter 8 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hazel Chant. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 8. The Parish Registers. I had noticed the Reverend Mr. Ridley sitting in the room with some other gentlemen of the neighbourhood, and had wondered what had brought him, a clergyman, there. I knew him well enough by sight. He was a vicar of a lonely parish away up in the hills, a tall, thin, student-looking man that you might occasionally see in the Berwick streets walking very fast with his eyes on the ground, as if, as the youngsters say, he was seeking sixpences. And I should not have thought him likely to be attracted to an affair of that sort by mere curiosity. And whatever he might be in his pulpit, he looked very nervous and shy as he stood up between the coroner and the jury to give his evidence. "Whatever are we going to hear now?" whispered Mr. Lindsay in my ear. "Didn't I tell you there'd be revelations about Gilverthwaite, Hugh, my lad?" Well, there's something coming out, but what can this parson know?" As it soon appeared, Mr. Ridley knew a great deal. After a bit of preliminary questioning, making things right in the proper legal fashion as to who he was and so on, the coroner put a plain inquiry to him. "Mr. Ridley, you have had some recent dealings with this man James Gilverthwaite, who has just been mentioned in connection with this inquiry?" he asked. "Some dealings recently, yes," answered the clergyman. "Just tell us in your own way what they were," said the coroner, "and of course when they took place." "Gilverthwaite," said Mr. Ridley, "came to me at my vicarage about a month or 5 weeks ago. I had previously seen him about the church and churchyard. He told me he was interested in parish registers and in antiquities generally, and asked if he could see our registers, offering to pay whatever fee was charged. I allowed him to look at the registers, but I soon discovered that his interest was confined to a particular period. The fact was, he wished to examine the various entries made between 1870 and 1880. That became very plain, but as he did not express his wish in so many words, I humoured him. Still, as I was with him during the whole of the time he was looking at the books, I saw what it was that he examined." Here Mr. Ridley paused, glancing at the coroner. "That is really about all that I can tell," he said. "He only came to me on that one occasion." "Perhaps I can get a little more out of you, Mr. Ridley," remarked the coroner with a smile. "A question or two now. What particular registers did this man examine? Births, deaths, marriages, which?" "All three, between the dates I have mentioned, 1870 to 1880, replied Mr. Ridley. "Did you think that he was searching for some particular entry?" "I certainly did think so." "Did he seem to find it?" asked the coroner with a shrewd glance. "If he did find such an entry," replied Mr. Ridley slowly, "he gave no sign of it. He did not copy or make a note of it, and he did not ask any copy of it from me. My impression, whatever it is worth, is that he did not find what he wanted in our registers. I am all the more convinced of that because—" Here Mr. Ridley paused, as if uncertain whether to proceed or not, but at an encouraging nod from the coroner he went on. "I was merely going to say, and I don't suppose it is evidence," he added, "that I understand this man visited several of my brother clergymen in the neighbourhood on the same errand. It was talked of at the last meeting of our rural deanery." "Ah," remarked the coroner significantly. "He appears, then, to have been going round examining the parish registers. We must get more evidence of that later, for I am convinced it has a bearing on the subject of this present inquiry. But a question or two more, Mr. Ridley. There are stipulated fees for searching the registers, I believe. Did Gilverthwaite pay them in your case?" Mr. Ridley smiled. "He not only paid the fees," he answered, "but he forced me to accept something for the poor box. He struck me as being a man who was inclined to be free with his money." The coroner looked at the solicitor who was representing the police. "I don't know if you want to ask this witness any questions?" he inquired. "Yes," said the solicitor. He turned to Mr. Ridley. "You heard what the witness Hugh Moneylaws said, that Gilverthwaite mentioned on his coming to Berwick that he had kinsfolk buried in the neighbourhood. You did? Well, Mr. Ridley, do you know if there are people of that name buried in your churchyard?" "There are not," replied Mr. Ridley promptly. "What is more, the name Gilverthwaite does not occur in our parish registers. I have a complete index of the registers from 1580, when they began to be kept, and there is no such name in it. I can also tell you this," he added. "I am, I think I may say, something of an authority on the parish registers of this district. I have prepared and edited several of them for publication, and I am familiar with most of them. I do not think that the name Gilverthwaite occurs in any of them." "What do you deduce from that now?" asked the solicitor. "That whatever it was the man was searching for, and I'm sure he was searching, it was not for particulars of his father's family," answered Mr. Ridley. "That is, of course, if his name really was what he gave it out to be, Gilverthwaite." "Precisely," said the coroner. "It may have been an assumed name." "The man may have been searching for the particulars of his mother's family," remarked the solicitor. "That line of thought would carry us too far afield just now," said the coroner. He turned to the jury. "I've allowed this evidence about the man Gilverthwaite, gentlemen," he said, "because it's very evident that Gilverthwaite came to this neighbourhood for some special purpose and wanted to get some particular information. And it's more than probable that the man into the circumstances of whose death we are inquiring was concerned with him in his purpose. But we cannot go any further today," he concluded, "and I shall adjourn the inquiry for a fortnight, when, no doubt, there'll be more evidence to put before you." I think that the folk who had crowded into that room, all agog to hear whatever could be told, went out of it more puzzled than when they came in. They split up into groups outside the inn and began to discuss matters amongst themselves, and presently 2 sharp-looking young fellows, whom I had seen taking notes at the end of the big table whereat the coroner and his officials sat, came up to me, and telling me that they were reporters specially sent over, one from Edinburgh, the other from Newcastle, begged me to give them a faithful and detailed account of my doings and experiences on the night of the murder. There was already vast interest in this affair all over the country, they affirmed, and whatever I could or would tell them would make splendid reading and be printed in big type in their journals. But Mr. Lindsey, who was close by, seized my arm and steered me away from these persistent seekers after copy. "Not just now, my lads," he said good-humouredly. "You've got plenty enough to go on with. You've heard plenty in there this morning to keep your readers going for a bit. Not a word, Hugh. And as for you, gentlemen, if you want to do something towards clearing up this mystery and assisting justice, there's something you can do, and nobody can do it better." "What's that?" asked one of them eagerly. "Ask through your columns for the relations, friends, acquaintances, anybody who knows them or aught about them, of these 2 men, James Gilverthwaite and John Phillips," replied Mr. Lindsey. "Noise it abroad as much as you like and can. If they've got folk belonging to them, let them come forward. For," he went on, giving them a knowing look, "there's a bigger mystery in this affair than any one of us has any conception of, and the more we can find out, the sooner it'll be solved. And I'll say this to you, young fellows, the press can do more than the police. There's a hint for you." Then he led me off, and we got into the trap in which he and I had driven out from Berwick, and as soon as we had started homeward he fell into a brown study and continued in it until we were in sight of the town. "Hugh, my lad," he suddenly exclaimed, at last starting out of his reverie, "I'd give a good deal if I could see daylight in this affair. I've had 22 years' experience of the law, and I've known some queer matters and some dark matters and some ugly matters in my time. But hang me if I ever knew one that promises to be as ugly and as dark and as queer as this does. That's a fact." "You're thinking it's all that, Mr. Lindsey?" I asked, knowing him as I did to be an uncommonly sharp man. "I'm thinking there's more than meets the eye," he answered. "Bloody murder we know there is. Maybe there'll be more, or maybe there has been more already. What was that deep old fish Gilverthwaite after? What took place between Phillips walking out of the inn at Coldstream Bridge and your finding of his body? Who met Phillips? Who did him to his death? And what were the 2 of them after in this corner of the country? Black mystery, my lad, on all hands." I made no answer just then. I was thinking, wondering if I should tell him about my meeting with Sir Gilbert Carstairs at the crossroads. Mr. Lindsey was just the man you could and would tell anything to, and it would maybe have been best if I had told him of that matter there and then. But there's a curious run of caution and reserve in our family. I got it from both father and mother, and deepened it on my own account. And I could not bring myself to be incriminating and suspicioning a man whose presence so near the place of the murder might be innocent enough. So I held my tongue. "I wonder will all the stuff in the newspapers bring anyone forward?" he said presently. "It ought to, if there is anybody." Nothing, however, was heard by the police or by ourselves for the next 3 or 4 days, and then, I think it was the 4th day after the inquest, I looked up from my desk in Mr. Lindsey's outer office one afternoon to see Maisie Dunlop coming in at the door, followed by an elderly woman, poorly but respectably dressed, a stranger. "Hugh," said Maisie, coming up to my side, "your mother asked me to bring this woman up to see Mr. Lindsey. She's just come in from the south, and she says she's yon James Gilverthwaite's sister." End of chapter 8. Recording by Hazel Chant, Tunbridge, Kent, England.
Chapter 9 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 9. The Marine Store Dealer. Mr. Lindsey was standing within his own room when Maisie and the strange woman came into the office, and, hearing what was said, he called us all three to go in to him, and, like myself, he looked at the woman with a good deal of curiosity, wanting, as I did, to see some likeness to the dead man. But there was no likeness to be seen, for whereas Gilverthwaite was a big and stalwart fellow, this was a small and spare woman, whose rusty black clothes made her look thinner and more meagre than she really was. All the same, when I spoke I knew there was a likeness between them, for her speech was like his, different altogether from ours of the border. "So you believe you're the sister of this man, James Gilverthwaite, ma'am?" began Mr. Lindsey, motioning the visitor to sit down, and beckoning Maisie to stop with us. "What might your name be now?" "I believe this man that's talked about in the newspapers is my brother, sir," answered the woman. "Else I shouldn't have taken the trouble to come all this way. My name's Hanson, Mrs. Hanson. I come from Garston, near Liverpool." "Aye, just so, a Lancashire woman," said Mr. Lindsey, nodding. "Your name would be Gilverthwaite, then, before you were married?" "To be sure, sir, same as James's," she replied. "Him and me was the only two there was. I've brought papers with me that'll prove what I say. I went to a lawyer before ever I came, and he told me to come at once, and bring my marriage lines, and a copy of James's birth certificate, and 1 or 2 other things of that sort. There's no doubt that this man we've read about in the newspapers was my brother, and of course I would like to put in my claim to what he's left, if he's left it to nobody else." "Just so," agreed Mr. Lindsey. "Aye, and how long is it since you last saw your brother now?" The woman shook her head, as if this question presented difficulties. "I couldn't rightly say to a year or 2. No, not even to a few years," she answered. "And to the best of my belief, sir, it'll be a good 30 years at the least. It was just after I was married to Hanson, and that was when I was about 23, and I was 56 last birthday. James came, once, to see me and Hanson soon after we were settled down, and I've never set eyes on him from that day to this. But I should know him now." "He was buried yesterday," remarked Mr. Lindsey. "It's a pity you didn't telegraph to some of us." "The lawyer I went to, sir, said, 'Go yourself,'" replied Mrs. Hanson. So I set off first thing this morning. Let me have a look at those papers, said Mr. Lindsey. He motioned me to his side, and together we looked through 2 or 3 documents which the woman produced. The most important was a certified copy of James Gilverthwaite's birth certificate, which went to prove that this man had been born in Liverpool about 62 years previously. That, as Mr. Lindsey was quick to point out, fitted in with what Gilverthwaite had told my mother and myself about his age. "Well," he said, turning to Mrs. Hanson, "you can answer some questions, no doubt, about your brother, and about matters in relation to him. First of all, do you know if any of your folks hailed from this part?" "Not that I ever heard of, sir," she replied. "No, I'm sure they wouldn't. They were all Lancashire folks, on both sides. I know all about them as far back as my great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers." "Do you know if your brother ever came to Berwick as a lad?" asked Mr. Lindsey, with a glance at me. "He might have done that, sir," said Mrs. Hanson. "He was a great masterful, strong lad, and he'd run off to sea by the time he was 10 years old. There'd been no doing aught with him for a couple of years before that. I knew that when he was about 12 or 13 he was on a coasting steamer that used to go in and out of Sunderland and Newcastle, and he might have put in here." "To be sure," said Mr. Lindsey. "But what's more important is to go on to his later history. You say you've never seen him for 30 years or more, but have you never heard of him?" She nodded her head with decision at that question. "Yes," she replied, "I have heard of him, just once. There was a man, a neighbour of ours, came home from Central America, maybe 5 years ago, and he told us he'd seen our James out there, and that he was working as a subcontractor, or something of that sort, on that Panama Canal there was so much talk about in them days." Mr. Lindsey and I looked at each other. Panama! That was the password which James Gilverthwaite had given me. So, here at any rate, was something, however little, that had the makings of a clue in it. "Aye," he said. "Panama now, he was there. And that's the last you ever heard?" "That's the very last we ever heard, sir," she answered, "till of course we saw these pieces in the papers this last day or two." Mr. Lindsey looked round on her with a sharp look. "Do you know aught of that man, John Phillips, whose name's in the papers too?" he asked. "No, sir, nothing," she replied promptly. "Never heard tell of him." "And you've never heard of your brother's having been seen in Liverpool of late?" he went on. "Never heard that he called to see any old friends at all? For we know, as you have seen in the papers, Mrs. Hanson, that he was certainly in Liverpool, and brought clothes and linens there within the last 3 months." "He never came near me, sir," she said, "and I never heard word of his being there from anybody." There was a bit of silence then, and at last the woman put the question which, it was evident, she was anxious to have answered definitely. "Do you think there will be a will, mister?" she asked. "For, if not, the lawyer I went to said what there was would come to me, and I could do with it." "We have seen nothing of any will," answered Mr. Lindsey, "and I should say there is none. And on satisfactory proof of your being next of kin, you'll get all he left. I've no doubt you're his sister, and I'll take the responsibility of going through his effects with you. You'll be stopping in the town a day or two? Maybe your mother, Hugh, can find Mrs. Hanson a lodging?" I answered that my mother would no doubt do what she could to look after Mrs. Hanson, and presently the woman went away with Maisie, leaving her papers with Mr. Lindsey. He turned to me when we were alone. "Some folks would think that was a bit of help to me in solving the mystery, Hugh," said he. "But hang me if I don't think it makes the whole thing more mysterious than ever. And do you know, my lad, where, in my opinion, the very beginning of it may have to be sought for?" "I can't put a word to that, Mr. Lindsey," I answered. "Where, sir?" "Panama!" he exclaimed, with a jerk of his head. "Panama! Just that! It began a long way off. Panama, as far as I see it. and what did begin and what was going on. The two men that knew, and could have told, are dead as doornails, and both buried for that matter. So, in spite of Mrs. Hanson's coming, and her revelations as to some, at any rate, of James Gilverthwaite's history, we were just as wise as ever at the end of the first week after the murder of John Phillips. And it was just the 8th night after my finding of the body that I got into the hands of Abel Crone. Abel Crone was a man that had come to Berwick about 3 years before this, from heaven only knows where, and had set himself up in a business as a marine store dealer in a back street which ran down to the shore of the Tweed. He was a little red-haired, pale-eyed rat of a man, with ferrety eyes and a goatee beard, quiet and peaceable in his ways, and inoffensive enough, but a rare hand at gossiping about the beach and the walls. You might find him at all odd hours, either in these public places, or in the door of his shop, talking away with any idler like himself. And how I came to get into talk with him on that particular night was here. Tom Dunlop, Maisie's young brother, was for keeping tame rabbits just then, and I was helping him to build hutches for the beasts in his father's backyard, and we were wanting some bits of stuff, iron and wire and the like, and knowing I would pick it up for a few pence at Crone's shop, I went round there alone. Before I knew how it came about, Crone was deep into the murder business. "They'll not have found much out by this time, yon police fellows, no doubt, Mr. Moneylaws," he said, eyeing me inquisitively in the light of the one naphtha lamp that was spurting and jumping in his untidy shop. "They're a slow, unoriginal lot, the police. There's no imagining their brains and no ingenuity in their minds. What's wanted in an affair like this is one of those geniuses you read about in the story-books, the men that can trace a murder from the way a man turns out his toes, or by the fashion he's bitten into a bit of bread that he's left on his plate, or the like of that. Something more than by ordinary, you'll understand me to mean, Mr. Moneylaws. Maybe you'll be taking a hand in this game yourself, Mr. Crone?" said I, thinking to joke with him. "You seem to have the right instinct for it, anyway." "Aye, well," he answered, "and I might be doing as well as anybody else, and no worse. You haven't thought of following anything up yourself, Mr. Moneylaws, I suppose?" "Me!" I exclaimed. "What should I be following up, man? I know no more than the mere surface facts of the affair." He gave a sharp glance at his open door when I thus answered him, and the next instant he was close to me in the gloom, and looking sharply in my face. "Are you so sure of that now?" he whispered cunningly. "Come now, I'll put a question to yourself, Mr. Moneylaws. What for did you not let on in your evidence that you saw Sir Gilbert Carstairs at yon crossroads just before you found the dead man? Come! You could have knocked me down with a feather, as the saying is, when he said that, and before I could recover from the surprise of it, he had a hand on my arm. 'Come this way,' he said. 'I'll have a word with you in private.'" End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Gesine. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 10. The Other Witness. It was with a thumping heart and nerves all a-tingle that I followed Abel Crone out of his front shop into a sort of office that he had at the back of it, a little dirty hole of a place, in which there was a ramshackle table, a chair or two, a stand-up desk, a cupboard, and the variety of odds and ends that he had picked up on his trade. The man's sudden revelation of knowledge had knocked all the confidence out of me. It had never crossed my mind that any living soul had a notion of my secret, for secret, of course, it was, and one that I would not have trusted to Crone, of all men in the world, knowing him as I did to be such a one for gossip. And he had let this challenge out on me so sharply. catching me unawares that I was alone with him, and, as it were, at his mercy. Before I could pull my wits together, everything in me was confused. I was thinking several things all at a time. How could he come to know? Had I been watched? Had some person followed me out of Berwick that night? Was this part of the general mystery? And what was going to come of it, now that Abel Crone was aware that I knew something which, up to then, I had kept back? I stood helplessly staring at him as he turned up the wick of an old lamp that stood on a mantelpiece littered with a mess of small things, and he caught a sight of my face when there was more light, and as he shut the door on us he laughed as if he knew that he had me in a trap. And before he spoke again, he went over to the cupboard and took out a bottle and glasses. "Will you taste?" he asked, leering at me. "A wee drop now? It'll do you good." "No," said I. "Then I'll drink for the two of us," he responded, and poured out a half-tumblerful of whisky, to which he added precious little water. "Here's to you, my lad, and may you have grace to take advantage of your chances." He winked over the rim of his glass as he took a big pull at its contents, and there was something so villainous in the look of him that it did me good in the way of steeling my nerves again. For I now saw that here was an uncommonly bad man to deal with, and that I had best be on my guard. "Mr. Crone," said I, gazing straight at him, "what's this you have to say to me?" "Sit you down," he answered, pointing at a chair that was shoved under one side of the little table. "Pull that out and sit you down. What we shall have to say to each other will not be said in 5 minutes. Let's confer in the proper and comfortable fashion." I did what he asked, and he took another chair himself, and sat down opposite me, propping his elbow on the table and leaning across it, so that, the table being but narrow, his sharp eyes and questioning lips were closer to mine than I cared for. And while he leaned forward in his chair, I sat back in mine, keeping as far from him as I could, and just staring at him, perhaps as if I had been some trapped animal that couldn't get itself away from the eyes of another that meant presently to kill it. Once again I asked him what he wanted. "You didn't answer my question," he said. "I'll put it again, and you needn't be afraid that anybody'll overhear us in this place. It's safe. I say once more, what for you did not tell in your evidence in that inquest, that you saw Sir Gilbert Carstairs at the crossroads on that night of the murder, "That's my business," said I. "Just so," said he. "And I'll agree with you in that. It is your business. But if by that you mean it's yours alone, and nobody else's, then I don't agree. Neither would the police." We stared at each other across the table for a minute of silence, and then I put the question directly to him that I had been wanting to put ever since he had first spoken, and I put it crudely enough. "How did you know?" I asked. He laughed at that, sneeringly, of course. "Aye, that's plain enough," said he. "No fencing about that. How did I know? Because when you saw Sir Gilbert, I wasn't 5 feet away from you, and what you saw, I saw. I saw you both." "You were there?" I exclaimed. "Snug behind the hedge in front of which you planted yourself," he answered. "And if you want to know what I was doing there, I'll tell you. I was doing, or had been doing, a bit of poaching. And as I say, what you saw, I saw." "Then I'll ask you a question, Mr. Crone," I said. "Why haven't you told yourself?" "Aye," he said. "You may well ask me that, but I wasn't called as a witness at yon inquest." "You could have come forward," I suggested. "I didn't choose," he retorted. We both looked at each other again, and while we looked, he swigged off his drink and helped himself just as generously to more. And as I was getting bolder by that time, I set to work at questioning him. "You'll be attaching some importance to what you saw?" said I. "Well," he replied slowly, "it's not a pleasant thing, for a man's safety, to be as near as what he was to a place where another man's just been done to his death." "You and I were near enough anyway," I remarked. "We know what we were there for," he flung back at me. "We don't know what he was there for." "Put your tongue on it, Mr. Crone," I said boldly. "The fact is, you suspicion him?" "I suspicion a good deal, maybe," he admitted. "After all, a man of that degree is only a man, when all's said and done, and there might be reasons that you and me knows nothing about. Let me ask you a question," he went on, edging nearer at me across the table. "Have you mentioned it to a soul?" I made a mistake at that, but he was on me so sharp, and his manner was so insistent, that I had the word out of my lips before I thought. "No," I replied, "I haven't." "Nor me," he said. "Nor me. So, you and me are the only two folk that know." "Well?" I asked. He took another pull at his liquor, and for a moment or two sat silent, tapping his fingernails against the rim of the glass. "It's a queer business, Moneylaws," he said at last. "Look at it any way you like, it's a queer business. Here's one man, yon lodger of your mother's, comes into the town and goes around the neighbourhood, reading the old parish registers and asking questions at the parson's. Aye, and he was at it, both sides of the Tweed. I've found that much out for myself. For what purpose? Is there money at the back of it, property, something of that sort, dependent on this Gilverthwaite unearthing some facts or other out of those old books? And then comes another man, a stranger, that's as mysterious in his movements as Gilverthwaite was, and he's to meet Gilverthwaite at a certain lonely spot, and at a very strange hour, and Gilverthwaite can't go, and he gets you to go, and you find the man murdered. And close by, you've seen this other man, who between you and me, though it's no secret, is as much a stranger to the neighbourhood as ever Gilverthwaite was, or Phillips was." "I don't follow you on that," I said. "No?" said he. "Then I'll make it plainer to you. Do you know that until Sir Gilbert Carstairs came here, not so long since, to take up his title and his house and the estate, he'd never set foot in the place, never been near the place, this 30 year? Man, and his own father, old Sir Alec, and his own sister, Mrs. Ralston of Craig, had never clapped eyes on him since he went away from Hathercleugh, a youngster of 21. "Do you tell me that, Mr. Crone?" I exclaimed, much surprised at his words. I didn't know so much. Where had he been, then? "God knows," said he, "and himself. It was said he was a doctor in London and in foreign parts. Him and his brother, elder brother, you're aware, Mr. Michael, they both quarrelled with the old baronet when they were little more than lads, and out they cleared, going their own ways. And news of Michael's death, and the proofs of it, came home not so long before old Sir Alec died, and as Michael had never married, of course the younger brother succeeded when his father came to his end last winter. And as I say, who knows anything about his past doings when he was away more than 30 years, nor what company he kept, nor what secrets he has? Do you follow me?" "I am following you, Mr. Crone," I answered. "It comes to this. You suspect Sir Gilbert?" "What I say," he answered, "is this. He may have had something to do with the affair. You cannot tell. But you and me knows he was near the place, coming from its direction, at the time the murder would be in the doing. And there's nobody knows but you and me." "What are you going to do about it?" I asked. He had another period of reflection before he replied, and when he spoke it was to the accompaniment of a warning look. "It's an ill-advised thing to talk about rich men," said he. "Yon man not only has money of his own, but what you might call considerable quantity. But his wife he brought with him is a woman of vast wealth, they tell me. It would be no very wise action on your part to set rumours going, Moneylaws, until you can substantiate them." What about yourself? I asked. You know as much as I do. Aye, and there's one word that sums it all up, says he, and it's a short one. Wait. There'll be more coming out. Keep your counsel a bit, and when the moment comes, and if the moment comes, why, you know there's me behind you to corroborate. And that's all. He got up then with a nod, as if to show that the interview was over, and I was that glad to get away from him that I walked off without another word. End of chapter 10. Recorded by Gesine in May 2007.
Chapter 11 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Skillen. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 11. Signatures to the Will. I was so knocked out of the usual run of things by this conversation with Crone that I went away forgetting the bits of stuff I had bought for Tom Dunlop's rabbit hutches and Tom himself, and for that matter, Maisie as well. And instead of going back to Dunlop's, I turned down the riverside, thinking. It was beyond me at that moment to get a clear understanding of the new situation. I couldn't make out what Crone was at. Clearly, he has strong suspicions that Sir Gilbert Carstairs had something to do with, or some knowledge of, the murder of Phillips. And he knew now that there were two of us to bear out each other's testimony that Sir Gilbert was near the scene of the murder at the time it was committed. Why then should he counsel waiting? Why should not the two of us go to the police and tell what we knew? What was it that Crone advised we should wait for? Was something going on, some inquiry being made in the background of things, of which he knew and wouldn't tell me? And this, I think, was chiefly in my thoughts. Was Crone playing some game of his own and designing to use me as a puppet in it? For there was a general atmosphere of subtlety and slyness about the man that forced itself upon me, young as I was. And the way he kept eyeing me as we talked made me feel that I had to do with one that would be hard to circumvent if it came to a matter of craftiness. And at last, after a lot of thinking, as I walked about in the dusk, it struck me that Crone might be for taking a hand in the game of which I had heard, but had never seen played. Blackmail. The more I thought over that idea, the more I felt certain of it. His hints about Sir Gilbert's money and his wealthy wife, his advice to wait till we knew more, all seemed to point to this, that evidence might come out which would but require our joint testimony, Crone's and mine, to make it complete. If that were so, then of course Crone or I, or, as he probably designed, the two of us, would be in a position to go to Sir Gilbert Carstairs and tell him what we knew, and ask him how much he would give us to hold our tongues. I saw all the theory of it at last clear enough, and it was just what I would have expected of Abel Crone, knowing him even little as I did. Wait until we were sure, and then strike. That was his game, and I was not going to have anything to do with it. I went home to my bed resolved on that. I'd heard of blackmailing, and I had a good notion of its wickedness and of its danger, and I was not taking shares with Crone in any venture of that sort. But there Crone was, an actual concrete fact that I'd got to deal with and come to some terms with, simply because he knew that I was in possession of knowledge which, to be sure, I ought to have communicated to the police at once, and I was awake much during the night, thinking matters over, and by the time I rose in the morning, I had come to a decision. I would see Crone at once, and give him a sort of ultimatum. Let him come there and then with me to Mr. Murray, and let the two of us tell what we knew and be done with it. If not, then I myself would go straight to Mr. Lindsay and tell him. I set out for the office earlier than usual that morning and went round by way of the back street, at the bottom of which Crone's store stood facing the river. I sometimes walked round that way of a morning, and I knew that Crone was, as a rule, at his place very early, amongst his old rubbish or at his favourite game of gossiping with the fishermen that had their boats drawn up there. But when I reached it, the shop was still shut, and though I waited as long as I could, Crone did not come. I knew where he lived, at the top end of the town, and I thought to meet him as I walked up to Mr. Lindsay's, but I had seen nothing of him by the time I reached our office door, so I laid the matter aside until noon, meaning to get a word with him when I went home to my dinner. And though I could have done so there and then, I determined not to say anything to Mr. Lindsay until I had given Crone the chance of saying it with me, to him or to the police. I expected, of course, that Crone would fly into a rage at my suggestion. If so, then I would tell him straight out that I would just take my own way and take it at once. But before noon, there was another development in this affair. In the course of the morning, Mr. Lindsay bade me go with him down to my mother's house, where Mrs. Hanson had been lodged for the night. We would go through Gilverthwaite's effects with her, he said, with a view to doing what we could to put her in possession. It might, probably would be, a lengthy and difficult business. That, he remarked, seeing that there was so much that was dark about her brother's recent movements. And as the woman was obviously poor, we had best be stirring on her behalf. So down we went, and in my mother's front parlour, the same that Gilverthwaite had taken as his sitting room, Mr. Lindsay opened the heavy box for the second time in Mrs. Hanson's presence, and I began to make a list of its contents. At the sight of the money it contained, the woman began to tremble. "Oh, mister," she exclaimed, almost tearfully, "but that's a sight of money to be lying there doing naught. I hope there'll be some way of bringing it to me and mine. We could do with it, I promise you." "We'll do our best, ma'am," said Mr. Lindsay. "As you're next of kin, there oughtn't to be much difficulty, and I'll hurry matters up for you as quickly as possible. What I want this morning is for you to see all there is in this chest. He seems to have had no other belongings than this and his clothes here at Mrs. Moneylaw's, at any rate. And as you see, beyond the money, there's little else in the chest but cigars and box after box of curiosities that he's evidently picked up in his travels. Coins, shells, ornaments, all sorts of queer things, some of them no doubt of value, but no papers, no letters, no documents of any sort." A notion suddenly occurred to me. "Mr. Lindsay," said I, "you've never turned out the contents of any of these smaller boxes the other night. There might be papers in one or other of them." "Good notion, Hugh, my lad," he exclaimed. "True, there might. Here goes, then. We'll look through them systematically." In addition to the half-dozen boxes full of prime Havana cigars, which lay at the top of the chest, there were quite a dozen of similar boxes, emptied of cigars and literally packed full of the curiosities of which Mr. Lindsay had just spoken. He had turned out and carefully replaced the contents of 3 or 4 of these when, at the bottom of one filled with old coins, which he said were Mexican and Peruvian, and probably of great interest to collectors, he came across a paper, folded and endorsed in bold letters, and he let out an exclamation as he took this paper out and pointed us to the endorsement. "Do you see that?" he said. "It's the man's will." The endorsement was plain enough. "My will, James Gilverthwaite," and beneath it was a date, 27th of August, 1904. There was a dead silence amongst the 4 of us. My mother had been with us all the time as Mr. Lindsay unfolded the paper, a thick half sheet of foolscap, and read what was written on it. "This is the last will and testament of me, James Gilverthwaite, a British subject, born at Liverpool, and formerly of Garston in Lancashire, England, now residing temporarily at Colon in the Republic of Panama. I devise and bequeath all my estate and effects, real and personal, which I may be possessed of or entitled to, unto my sister, Sarah Ellen Hanson, the wife of Matthew Hanson, of 37 Preston Street, Garston, Lancashire, England, absolutely, and failing her to any children she may have had by her marriage with Matthew Hanson, in equal shares. And I appoint the said Sarah Ellen Hanson, or in the case of her death, her eldest child, the executor of this my will, and I revoke all former wills, dated this 27th day of August, 1904, James Gilverthwaite, signed by the testator in the presence of us. Mr. Lindsay suddenly broke off, and I, looking at him, saw his eyes screw themselves up with sheer wonder at something he saw. Without another word, he folded up the paper, put it in his pocket, and turning to Mrs. Hanson, clapped her on the shoulders. "That's all right, ma'am," he said heartily. "That's a good will. Duly signed and attested. There'll be no difficulty about getting it admitted to probate. Leave it to me and I'll see to it, and get it through for you as soon as ever I can. And we must do what's possible to find out if this brother of yours has left any other property. Meanwhile, we'll just lock everything up again that we've taken out of the chest." It was close on my dinner hour when we'd finished, but Mr. Lindsay, at his going, motioned me out into the street with him. In a quiet corner he turned to me and pulled the will from his pocket. "Hugh," he said, "do you know who's one of the witnesses to this will?" "Aye, who are the two witnesses?" "Man, you could have knocked me down with a feather when I saw the names. Look for yourself." He handed me the paper and pointed to the attestation clause with which it ended, and I saw the two names at once: John Phillips, Michael Carstairs, and I let out a cry of astonishment. "Aye, you may well exclaim," said he, taking the will back. "John Phillips, that's the man was murdered the other night. Michael Carstairs, that's the elder brother of Sir Gilbert yonder at Hathercleugh, the man that would have succeeded to the title and estates if he hadn't predeceased old Sir Alexander. What would he be doing now, a friend of Gilverthwaite's?" "I've heard this Michael Carstairs went abroad as a young man, Mr. Lindsay, and never come home again," I remarked. "Likely he foregathered with Gilverthwaite out yonder." "Oh, just that," he agreed. "That would be the way of it, no doubt, to be sure. He's set down in this attestation clause as Michael Carstairs, engineer, American Quarter, Colon, and John Phillips is described as subcontractor of the same address. The three of them will have been working in connection with the Panama Canal. But God bless us, there's some queer facts coming out, my lad. Michael Carstairs knows Gilverthwaite, and Phillips in yon corner of the world, Phillips and Gilverthwaite, when Michael Carstairs is dead, come home to the corner of the world that Michael Carstairs sprang from, and Phillips is murdered as soon as he gets here, and Gilverthwaite dies that suddenly that he can't tell us a word of what it's all about. What is it all about, and who's going to piece it all together? Man, there's more than murder at the bottom of all this. It's a wonder that I didn't let out everything that I knew at that minute, and it may have been the tip of my tongue, but just then he gave me a push towards our door. "I heard your mother say your dinner was waiting you," he said. "Go in now, we'll talk more this afternoon." He strode off up the street, and I turned back and made haste with my dinner. I wanted to drop in at Crone's before I went again to the office. What had just happened had made me resolved that Crone and I should speak out, and if he wouldn't, then I would. And presently I was hurrying away to his place. and as I turned into the back lane that led to it, I ran up against Sergeant Chisholm. "Here's another fine to do, Mr. Moneylaws," he said. "You'll know yon Abel Crone, the marine store dealer. Aye, well, he's been found drowned, not an hour ago, and by this and that, there's queer marks that looks like violence on him." End of chapter 11. Recording by Ian Skillen.
Chapter 12 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 12. The Salmon Gaff. I gave such a jump on hearing this that Chisholm himself started, and he stared at me with a question in his eyes. But I was quick enough to let him know that he was giving me news that I hadn't heard until he opened his lips. "You don't tell me that!" I exclaimed. "What, more of it?" "Aye," he said. "You'll be thinking that this is all of a piece with the other affair. And to be sure, they found Crone's body close by where you found yon other man, Phillips." "Where, then?" I asked. "And when?" "I tell you, not an hour ago," he replied. "The news just came in. I was going down here to see if any of the neighbours at the shop saw Crone in any strange company last night." I hesitated for a second or two and then spoke out. "I saw him myself last night," said I. "I went to his shop, maybe it was 9 o'clock, to buy some bits of stuff to make Tom Dunlop a door to his rabbit hutch, and I was there talking to him 10 minutes or so. He was all right then, and I saw nobody else with him." "Aye, well, he never went home to his house last night," observed Chisholm. "I called in there on my way down. He lived, you know, in a cottage by the police station, and I dropped in and asked the woman that keeps house for him had she seen him this morning, and she said he never came home last night at all, and no wonder, as things are." "But you were saying where it happened," I said. "Where he was found," said he. "Well, and it was where Till runs into Tweed, leastways, a bit up the Till. Do you know John McIlwraith, lad, yon youngster that they've had such a bother with about the school, always running away to his play and stopping out at nights, and the like? There was the question of sending him to a reformatory, you'll remember. Aye, well, it turns out the young waster was out last night in those woods below Twizel, and early this morning, though he didn't let on at it till some time after, he saw the body of a man lying in one of them deep pools in Till, and when he himself was caught by Turndale, who was on the lookout for him, he told of what he'd seen, and Turndale and some other men went there, and they found Crone." "You were saying there were marks of violence?" said I. "I haven't seen them myself," he answered, "but by Turndale's account, it was him brought in the news. There is queer marks on the body, like as if, as near as Turndale could describe it, as if the man had been struck down before he was drowned. Bruises, you understand." "Where is he?" I asked. "He's where they took Phillips," replied Chisholm. "Dod, that's 2 of 'em that's been taken there within, aye, nearly within the week." "What are you going to do now?" I inquired. "I was just going, as I said, to ask a question or two down here. Did anybody hear Crone say anything last night about going out that way?" he answered. "But there, I don't see the good of it. Between you and me, Crone was a bit of a night bird. I suspected him of poaching, time and again. Well, he'll do no more of that. You'll be on your way to the office, likely?" "Straight there," said I. "I'll tell Mr. Lindsey of this." But when I reached the office, Mr. Lindsey, who had been out to get his lunch, knew all about it. He was standing outside the door, talking to Mr. Murray, and as I went up the superintendent turned away to the police station, and Mr. Lindsey took a step or two towards me. "Have you heard this about that man Crone?" he asked. "I've just heard it now," I answered. "Chisholm told me." He looked at me, and I at him. There were questions in the eyes of both of us. But between parting from the police sergeant and meeting Mr. Lindsey, I had made up my mind, by a bit of sharp thinking and reflection, on what my own plan of action was going to be about all this, once and for all, and I spoke before he could ask anything. "Chisholm," said I, "was down that way, wondering could he hear word of Crone's being seen with anybody last night. I saw Crone last night. I went to his shop, buying some bits of old stuff. He was all right then. I saw nothing. Chisholm, he says Crone was a poacher. That would account, likely, for his being out there." "Aye," said Mr. Lindsey, "but they say there's marks of violence on the body. And the long and short of it is, my lad," he went on, first interrupting himself and then giving me an odd look, "the long and short of it is, it's a queer thing that Crone should have come by his death close to the spot where you found yon man Phillips. There may be nothing but coincidence in it, but there's no denying it's a queer thing. Go and order a conveyance, and we'll drive out yonder." In pursuance of the determination I had come to, I said no more about Crone to Mr. Lindsey. I had made up my mind on a certain course, and until it was taken I could not let out a word of what was by that time nobody's secret but mine, to him, nor to any one, not even to Maisie Dunlop, to whom, purposely, I had not as yet said anything about my seeing Sir Gilbert Carstairs on the night of Phillips's murder. And all the way out to the inn there was silence between Mr. Lindsey and me, and the event of the morning, about Gilverthwaite's will, and the odd circumstance of its attestation by Michael Carstairs, was not once mentioned. We kept silence, indeed, until we were in the place to which they had carried Crone's dead body. Mr. Murray and Sergeant Chisholm had got there before us, and with them was a doctor, the same that had been fetched to Phillips, and they were all talking together quietly when we went in. The superintendent came up to Mr. Lindsey. "According to what the doctor here says," he whispered, jerking his head at the body, which lay on the table with a sheet thrown over it, "there's a question as to whether the man met his death by drowning. Look here." He led us up to the table, drew back the sheet from the head and face, and motioning the doctor to come up, pointed to a mark that was just between the left temple and the top of the ear, where the hair was wearing thin. "D'ye see that now?" he murmured. "You'll notice there's some sort of a weapon penetrated there. Penetrated! But the doctor can say more than I can on that point." "The man was struck, felled by some sort of a weapon," said the doctor. "It's penetrated, I should say from mere superficial examination, to the brain. You'll observe there's a bruise outwardly. Aye, but this has been a sharp weapon as well, something with a point, and there's the puncture. How far it may extend I can't tell yet. But on the surface of things, Mr. Lindsey, I should incline to the opinion that the poor fellow was dead or dying when he was thrown into yon pool. Anyway, after a blow like that, he'd be unconscious. But I'm thinking he was dead before the water closed on him." Mr. Lindsey looked closer at the mark, and at the hole in the centre of it. "Has it struck any of you how that could be caused?" he asked suddenly. "It hasn't? Then I'll suggest something to you. There's an implement in pretty constant use hereabouts that would do just that. A salmon gaff." The two police officials started. The doctor nodded his head. "Aye, that's a sensible remark," said he. "A salmon gaff would just do it." He turned to Chisholm with a sharp look. "You were saying this man was suspected of poaching?" he asked. "Likely it'll have been some poaching affair he was after last night, him and others, and they may have quarrelled and come to blows, and there you are." "Were there any signs of a fray close by or near, on the bank?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "We're going down there now, ourselves, to have a look round," answered Mr. Murray. "But according to Turndale, the body was lying in a deep pool in the Till, under the trees on the bank. It might have lain there for many a month if it hadn't been for yon young McIlwraith, that has a turn for prying into dark and out of the way corners. Well, here's more matter for the coroner." Mr. Lindsey and I went back to Berwick after that, and once more he said little on the journey, except that it would be well if it came out that this was but a poaching affair in which Crone had got across with some companion of his. And for the rest of the afternoon he made no further remark to me about the matter, nor about the discovery of the morning. But as I was leaving the office at night he gave me a word. "Say nothing about that will to anybody," said he. "I'll think that matter over tonight, and see what'll come of my thinking. It's as I said before, Hugh. To get at the bottom of all this, we'll have to go back, maybe a far way." I said nothing and went home, for now I had work of my own. I was going to what I had resolved on after Chisholm told me the news about Crone. I would not tell my secret to Mr. Lindsey, nor to the police, nor even to Maisie. I would go straight and tell it to the one man whom it concerned, Sir Gilbert Carstairs. I would speak plainly to him and be done with it. And as soon as I had eaten my supper I mounted my bicycle, and, as the dusk was coming on, rode off to Hathercleugh House. End of chapter 12.